This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the biggest films in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. Welcome, you're listening to Jay's Analysis. If you heard last week's discussion, I was talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters, and we got into the history of punk music, and John's approach was a little more broad spectrum. John took a sort of third eye view perspective, so to speak. I'm joking there, all you haters. John was taking a God's eye perspective and looking at the big picture of social engineering in relationship to the punk genre, and then later in the second hour we got into kind of subgenres and sub-subgenres that flow out of punk and or are connected to it. And originally I intended to have the co-researcher Nino, but the Skype connection was weak due to the Wi-Fi that I was using there. So what we've done is split it up. I've got Nino with me today, and if you want to check out their collected work on this topic, it's put together at a really cool blog. I've been perusing it this week. The Four Horses Asses of the Apocalypse. How are you, Nino?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I will have a link in the show description for the Four Horses Asses of the Apocalypse, which is again all of their series collected together. I think you guys have done 9 installments?
Roughly.
Okay. And what Nino and I are going to do is, first of all, we're going to maybe respond to a lot of the criticisms that we had in the comments. There was a lot of people who, in fact, I put it up in 2 places on Facebook, and the threads got so long and so involved, I couldn't even follow it. It was lost. There was like 60 comments on one, 50 comments on another one. It was going way over my head. A lot of bands I'd never heard of. Again, punk's not my genre, but I find it fascinating because it does relate to a lot of other genres and, topics that I do focus on, like Hollywood. All of these industries, especially entertainment, are all part of social engineering. They're all interrelated. So what Nino and I are going to do is kind of give a response to some of the criticisms. I know one guy was really kind of going after John by talking about the connection between punk and psychedelic. And Nino's got a lot of the deets. Okay, he's the deet man. He's got it all connected. I've heard him talk about it. He knows what he's talking about. He's done deep research on this subject. And so we're going to get more of the inductive, precise precision, the scalpel of Nino, as opposed to the godlike vision of John Adams that we had from the sky. Nino's going to be down here cutting it to pieces on the ground. So Nino, somebody says, I don't believe this. This is crazy. Punk is organic. There's no connection between psychedelic music and punk. That's crazy.
It is crazy. It's crazy that guy said that. It actually, I can knock two birds out of the bush with this topic, and we can deal with the psychedelic issue, and we can also deal with the handoff from hippies to punkers via beat poets.
Okay. So
both beat poets are catalysts to the drug introduction, specifically LSD and psychedelics, and they are the connecting forces to the previous love children hippies. So I'm going to bring up 4 general beat poet extraordinaires, and I'm going to go with the home run right out of the gate. First beat poet I'd like to talk about is world famous trust funder William Burroughs. And just to squash with him real quickly, he's actually known as the godfather of punk rock. William Burroughs is the godfather of punk rock according to mainstream media sources, liberal and conservative, across the board. So that's part of his title. William Burroughs is connected to psychedelics. And again, I'm just going right for the guts on this. And he's connected in one historical text called the Yage Papers. And those are papers exchanged between him and Allen Ginsberg, referencing ayahuasca use. So one right out of the gate, the godfather of punk rock, the whole entity punk rock is William Burroughs, and William Burroughs has a very shady, spooky background, and he is directly connected to psychedelics. And if for historical record, just go check out the Yage papers between him and Ginsberg.
Oh, that's so right. Yeah, there, he was also interestingly interested in going into espionage. He tried to go into the OSS. I believe he was turned down due to like a drug use or something like that.
Or was he?
Exactly right. That could be a sort of sheep dip cover, and he could have been absolutely recruited. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a regular at the Hotel Chelsea, and Hotel Chelsea pretty much was the womb of New York punk rock. So again, right there's one direct link between those catalyzing elements. Another guy I like to bring up is none other than Tim Leary. Oh, he is another. He's another spearhead in the LSD counterculture hippie movement, and Tim Leary has his fingerprints all over the punk scene. One specific quote that's quite fun is, let me see here. It's in regards to David Byrne of the Talking Heads, and this is a quote from Timothy Leary. I mention you in every lecture I give because you represent the 21st century concept of international global coming together through electronics. How did you get into that? And this is from an interview between Leary and David Byrne. I just cut that little snippet. So allegedly Timothy Leary mentions David Byrne every single time he's at a lecture. That's pretty influential on that level. Jumping sideways, we're going to talk about a Velvet Underground member that not very many people have heard of, but he was their first drummer. The first drummer of the Velvet Underground from New York was Angus MacLeish. And Angus MacLeish was a student of Aleister Crowley. He was involved with a Theater of Eternal Music, which had a number of other New York art, I don't even know what to call them, artists.
Right.
He was actually him and Lou Reed had some issues getting along, and John made the comment, if you're a little too rowdy for Lou Reed, there's something up with you. So Angus MacLeish was he left the band, was wanted to come back before they got famous. They wouldn't let him in. But he's an open-face occultist, a student of Crowley's, and the Leary connection is Timothy Leary presided over his wedding at Golden Gate Park. So we have Timothy Leary reaching out to Angus MacLeish, marrying MacLeish and his wife.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean it's everywhere, and just a little fun history on these weirdos. And some strange stuff that makes you wonder what's going on. His wife's name was Hetty MacLeish, and Hetty MacLeish bequeathed a collection of her husband's tapes to the Yale Collection of American Literature. So Yale had an interest in this this drummer from. Sorry, this stuff's comical to me. Yale had an interest in the writings of this occultist drummer from Velvet Underground. And the papers were left to Yale in a will, and they wanted them.
Well, I wanted to add too. You mentioned Yale in relation to Burroughs. Burroughs went to Harvard. Now, Harvard is, of course, the birthplace of Leary and the promotion of LSD and MK Ultra through the academic sphere, and then into the pop culture. But it's also important to remember that Burroughs was connected to Ivy Lee, and that was his maternal uncle was Ivy Lee, who is one of the pioneer publicists for the Rockefellers, right? The father of modern PR and so forth, if I recall. And then so Burroughs is already into the drug culture prior to its popularization. And he's also into the LGBT gay rights community back before that was even a thing. So that's who you're talking about. Let's see. I think if I remember, Burroughs studied anthropology and medicine, and he was also at Columbia for a while doing grad work there. And Columbia is obviously a total spook college, just like Harvard and Yale. And then when he goes to Germany, I think he ends up in like just all these gay circles, right? And he's pioneering the left and the cultural Marxist movements and so forth in Europe, hanging out with all these the gays and so forth. Again, this is far prior to, this is like 30s or something like that, 20s, 30s, way prior to anybody knowing about like an LGBT movement.
Yeah, he's a sick puppy. He also lived with Peter Lamborn Wilson, and that guy is the dude trying to create. He's a member of NAMBLA, same as Ginsburg, and he's the guy for trying to, or who is creating the idea, temporary autonomous zone. So it's Burning Man and all these ideas.
Oh, okay.
By movement. So yeah, like Burroughs lived with Peter Lamborn Wilson. So yeah, like the guy's a sick puppy,
Yeah, and keeping it in the occult circles, Harry Hay, who's the founder of the American gay rights movement, one of the forefathers of it, he's also a NAMBLA member, and he played, I think, organ in Crowley's chapel at the Agape Lodge.
Yeah, that's not surprising.
So you mentioned the Beat Poets. I wanted to read one quick quote here from Allen Ginsberg, and this is from the book LSD and the American Dream, Storming Heaven by Jay Stevens, which is a very informative book, although it's written as a kind of a whitewash and kind of a way to say that the movements of the 60s and so forth that we're talking about, it doesn't really, it kind of hints at them being engineered with corporate stuff in the background like Sandow's Pharmaceuticals, but doesn't really get into it being an intentional conspiracy. And of course I believe that it is, and I think Nino does too. And what Stevens does point out, though, is a lot of weird stuff that I'd never seen anywhere else, like Ginsberg taking peyote in 1955, and he interestingly thinks he sees Molech, and he writes this poem, and he says that America is Molech, whatever that means. And now that is always stuck in my mind since I read this book several years ago. I did a video on this actually about 7 or 8 years ago, one of the first YouTube videos, and I pointed out, like, I don't think it's weird that it's right after this America takes a very pro-abortion stance, and of course Molech was all about human and child sacrifice, and on the part of the state. The Bible talks about this stuff many times in the Old Testament. I just always thought it was weird that Ginsberg's tripping out and he says he sees Molech and that Molech is America. Maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know, but yeah. So you're getting to the point that there's a direct connect between the fathers of punk and Ginsberg, these OTO characters, and so forth. You want to go ahead? Yeah.
I'm going to just stick with Ginsberg, I guess. Like I said, or actually I'll go back to Timothy Leary for a sec. Leary, again, he makes a comment on David Byrne, and that shows the earliest origins of punk rock, and he did a number of interviews with many other hardcore punkers. That was the change in terminology roughly for the 80s, and a main one would be like Jello Biafra, and Jello Biafra's got his hands all over the punk scene with Strangeness. Probably stay away from him, but yeah, so we got Timothy Leary on all, for over a decade's worth of punkers, influencing them, interviewing them, being interviewed by them, so on and so forth. A punk band actually called the Fugs, Fugs. Let me try and find them here. They actually used the term turn on, tune in, drop out, which originally came from Marshall McLuhan, but Timothy Leary famous. But again, the Fugs use it too. And the Fugs, they're connected to Harry Everett Smith, the occultist I mentioned earlier, that I'm going to re-mention again. These guys attempted to, and I think you might have touched on this, these guys, the Fugs, were part of the posse, and they're considered proto-punk, were part of the posse that tried to levitate the Pentagon.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was so that was one of the punk bands trying to do that. A fun little side note, in that movie Burn After Reading, the song CIA Man, that's the Fugs.
Oh, so that's, okay.
Yeah, that's a little nugget of, coincidence. Let me see here. And yeah, so Timothy Leary crosses other thresholds. He crosses the threshold with the Hells Angels, which show up in Origins of Punk Rock. Just a little trivia note: Timothy Leary is the godfather of Winona Ryder.
Yes, yeah. Actually, I was surprised because I was doing a analysis of Stranger Things back when that was premiering on Netflix, and I wrote a pretty lengthy article about it. And then right when I was about done with it, I was coming across this picture of her. I couldn't believe it. I was like, Winona Ryder, because she's in it, right? Like, there's Winona Ryder with Timothy Leary. What the fuck? And yeah, so that's her godfather or something, right?
Yeah, it's bizarro. So there's two down right there, some counterculture LSD connections. Well, another poet, and again, I blurred in Leary. He wasn't so much a poet, but he was definitely spooky is my term. And in the midst of hippie movement, LSD movement, Huxley friendship, like he's a deep character.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's not hard to believe if you think about the fact that, what a punk artist strives to do, or musician or whatever, is, at least on the surface, right? The whole thing is about being anti-establishment. It's about F the system, F the world, blah, blah, blah. And why wouldn't Timothy Leary or Terence McKenna, why wouldn't Terence McKenna like the punk artist? That's my Terence McKenna impersonation. Because they're always talking about this sort of Dionysian approach to things, right? They're always talking about it like they're shamans, they're these new saviors. If you saw Men Who Stare at Goats, right? I mean, that's all straight up First Earth Battalion, LSD type stuff. And that was all part of the social engineering. I think that was just kind of an addendum to MK Ultra. And that was also pioneering LSD use and biowarfare and so forth by special forces. So they even say, like the generals involved in that even talk about themselves like they're shamans and saviors. And I think that's what Timothy Leary was doing. And if you read his book, like on Tibetan Buddhism and LSD, I forget the name, it's like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Journey of something. I read that a long time ago. If you read that, you start to see this pattern of all the people that kind of studied Crowleyanism. They realized that, like, the higher levels of Crowleyanism, that was all about starting your own cult. So when you graduate from it, and it's not accidental that Gerald Gardner, L. Ron Hubbard, these different characters that graduate from Crowley's grad school of Masonry, the OTO, and the AA, Argenteum Astrum, all this, that they go and then they start their own religions, you see. I don't know for sure that Leary graduated per se, but he did obviously study Crowleyanism in depth. In fact, there's YouTube interviews where Leary's sitting there talking about how great Crowley is, right? So the higher levels of that, you can actually read the rituals that it's about starting your own religion. You become an avatar, so to speak, quote unquote, whether you believe that or not. You just are mind controlling people, and you basically just become a cult leader. Now, obviously that would appeal to a kind of person who's a rock star. You would want to have those same tricks, techniques, right? You see what I'm saying? So there should be an obvious connect between the drug scene, psychedelics, and rock stardom. And I know that punk is supposed to be anti-star and all this stuff, but it ends up being the very thing that it's supposed to not be, I would say.
And it was always been something different than we thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I was into it for a short period of time, and it was the hardcore punk genre, and like it's totally not at all what I thought it was. Nothing is. And then looking back, some of the behaviors I displayed in my life and during that time, it's like, wow, I'm just a dupe to social groups most of my life until I've had a recent wake up, right about last decade by having a kid. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can empathize, sympathize pretty accurately.
Yeah, a lot of my
power.
friends too were very into different scenes, be it music scene, rave scene, DJ scene, or whatever. But then having a kid is usually a pretty big wake up call.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to take us to another direction? I remember we were kind of on this religious occult section of it, but I wanted to save some of that for later. But it does relate because Ginsberg also blended all of these religions in his thought into this kind of weird syncretism. And if all the punk guys, or a lot of the punk guys and people, are into these people, right, they're going to be interested in the same types of stuff. They're going to be interested in Ginsberg's interest in Buddhism and Zen and yoga and meditation and chanting and the use of LSD.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest with you, it's hard to believe even Ginsberg had anything to do with punk, like as a person, it's just unbelievable. Thought he was just some radical poet, but he's tied at the hip with punk, and as beat poetry is. Should we just rattle some Ginsberg fun off?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so Allen Ginsberg has some direct ties to punk rock, and I'm going to go down a couple rabbit holes. First off, some news. Allen Ginsberg allegedly dated women, according to this book, Beat Punk, and he dated a couple women in New York. One of the women was named Denise Mercedes, and she was in a punk band called the Stimulators. And allegedly, Denise Mercedes dated both Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky. So that was, kind of a left turn for what I thought Allen Ginsberg was doing. But yeah, it's out there in the lexicon by books.
And who's Peter Orlovsky?
That's Ginsberg's lifetime lover.
Okay.
His boyfriend, husband or whatever. It's common law husband or whatever.
Right.
So this punk band had a female in it that dated both these characters that are icons to poets and gay people and drug users in counterculture.
Do you get the impression that some of it was a put on? Kind of like, for example, Miley Cyrus says she's gender fluid, which I wonder if she really is, or are these people maybe being recruited to be the face of the latest phases of the revolution? You know what I mean? Like is she just promoting that because it sounds cool, or what people think is edgy? You know what I mean?
I think it's a combination of both. I think a lot of it's a put on and just written into history, and I think some of it's true. So just to digress a little bit and stay on that thought, the reality when I truly have done my examination, and there's a lot more to go, is punk was truthfully a lot smaller in scale compared to the numbers of people in America, for example, or in society, than we can imagine, because us as punkers are hanging out with punkers, so it seems like there's a lot of punkers, but it's really a microcosm of a microcosm of music genre that the number of people involved in it are. So it actually is a phenomena that I think is similar to like War of the Worlds, where it's always sucked. The show's always had, not very many people early on, but we were told repeatedly through media, through controversial interviews, through daytime television, through all these outlets that it's getting big, or it's bigger, or it's outlandish, and it's this. So I feel it's always been, not always, like it took a turn for like a real sizable number of people semi-recently, but it's still not even a massive percentage of our population. But I think it's one of those phenomena where I think it's a bunch of bullshit, excuse my language. It's a bunch of just, like this happened, that happened, set up events, staged events, cops being called intentionally to go to the show to get publicity.
PR stuff, stunts.
Yeah, like, it's out there. So I think it's a combination of both.
Well, that's we see that even now. I mean, for example, this giant women's march with all these transgenders and feminists out there protesting Trump. This is actually mainstream news that 40 of the 50 groups are funded by Soros that are putting on this giant women's march. Very egregious displays. Sort of the feminine Pussy Riot type stuff. Women wearing giant vagina suits. I'm not joking. They look like they're dressed up like a calzone. Doesn't look like a vagina, but a very nasty vagina if it is one. But all this display, this spectacle, is intentionally done to give the impression that this is a big deal. And I think the best example of that is transgender. This is like 0.00001% of the population, people who are actually trans or whatever, having what I believe is a mental problem. And it's been thrust into the mainstream media, shoved down our throats for the last 3 or 4 years through the Bruce Gender thing. So it's completely foisted upon everybody as if this was a giant issue, and it's hardly anybody that's an actual piece of the population.
Yeah, exactly. That's
and
exactly
what you said. Ginsburg, Burroughs, these are pioneers of the homosexuality gay rights movement. And we're going to start seeing that trend. I didn't know this, by the way, because I'm not too up on punk, but I think John was making the point as well that a lot of these people are going to be these sort of pioneers of alternative, quote-unquote, lifestyles.
Definitely social justice vanguards.
Oh, there you go.
Good label. So back to Ginsburg. He's been tied up with the stimulators. Now, another member of the stimulators was a lad named Harley Flanagan. And he's more infamous for a hardcore band a few years later called the Cro-Mags out of New York. And so when Harley joined the Stimulators, he was about, I think, 11 years old. I could be off, so give or take, or take a couple years. So 9 to 11 years old. And they asked him to be the drummer. And he became the drummer. And so I found this connection between Harley and his aunt and then Peter Orlovsky's Allen Ginsberg. So I'm like, oh, that's odd. So I followed that rabbit hole, and I came to find out that Allen Ginsberg has known Harley Flanagan since the age of 1. Allen Ginsberg published a book of poems for Harley at like the age of 9, and you can find pictures of the poetry book, and it's like a picture of Harley with a little like a robe and little leather devil horn helmet, and he's holding like a stick, and to me it's like a magic wand. So to me, like, that photo instantly sent chills up my spine because I have like a different worldview than most beat poet fans. Mm-hmm. I also knew that Ginsberg, open-faced member of NAMBLA, so it was kind of concerning. And then we find that Harley goes on to start this band called the Cro-Mags, and the Cro-Mags end up being a breakthrough band for the sound of what's hardcore punk, and it became a little more specifically New York hardcore punk. And they had some really unique ideas. Their band's ideas were focused around Krishna, and they had the singer's name was John Joseph. He came from a rapey childhood, a Krishna background. He knew Joel Rifkin for some strange odd reason, and Joel Rifkin is a serial killer who killed a famous punk rock singer's prostitute girlfriend.
Hold on, slow down. So when you're saying Krishna, are you saying like the Moonies, or are you saying like Hinduism?
Like Hinduism.
Okay.
Like the actual Krishna with like all those weird right. 8-armed gods and, all that stuff.
Right, because it's weird. I've always wondered about, I don't want to get too off topic, but it just popped in my head, the Beatles, and then of course George Harrison's affinity with the Moonies and Krishna. It's, you know what I mean? And if you look into the Moonies, that's a total CIA cult.
Oh yeah, and you find, just off topic for a second, you find strange anomalies. So I've done some really broad research, and I found that 19 people that signed the United Nations Charter in 1945, and there was only 50. 19 of them came out of the same school in Beirut. Okay, so I started looking through all these guys. And a lot of them are world leaders for other nations, but a lot of the white guys I suspect to be spooks. Uh-huh. But they end up being like Buddhists. And Steve Jobs' biological father came out of these Beirut schools, and they're Buddhists. Like, so the upper echelon of this intelligence that has enough power to shit out 19 members of the UN signing delegate, they're roaming around in Buddhism. You know what I'm saying? So it's really bizarre, the stuff that I've come across doing this research.
Yeah, I have some buddies who've done some in-depth research into different Buddhist, I forget what they're called, like not a guru, but the weird stuff behind Tibetan Buddhism, and that a lot of what actually goes on in Tibetan Buddhism is not what people in the West think it is. There's like a left-hand dark path of Tibetan Buddhism that people go down, or supposedly, and you're basically at the whim of your spiritual guide or whatever. You kind of have to do whatever he says, and the idea is this dark path, right? Like if he tells you that you have to, perform fellatio on him and eat feces, you got to do it.
Yeah.
Well, to me that sounds like a cult, but
it is. It is.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to get sidetracked. So there's this Krishna ideas running around. Another member was Paris Mayhew, and his father was a music producer, and he was like a trust fund kid. So we got a trust fund kid. We got this guy who, again, knew a serial killer, was molested a number of times during foster care, fell in with the Krishnas, and he actually in his book writes about dressing up like a homeless Santa Claus and panhandling and getting thousands of dollars and giving it to the Krishnas. And he also talks about ignoring when he would see pedophilic acts in the Krishna Dome, too. So he gives a bunch of dirt on Krishna. Back to Harley. And then we got Harley, and he, again, has been affiliated with Allen Ginsberg since the age of 1. So this band is completely chaotic. They're groundbreaking with the sound. They have all these really unique characters. But we find also, I'm going to go back to Harley now, we find also Harley breaks the American lexicon another way, and he's the first American skinhead. So of the skinhead movement, he's the first American one, and he got, I guess, christened, for lack of a better term, or knighted or whatever, in Ireland, and came back and put out a bunch of ads in punk rock fanzines and started the first skinhead group in New York. And again, skinheads weren't started originally as racist. It was like this working class oi kind of Jamaican mix, but then it did migrate towards racism. And I believe Harley migrated toward the racist version too, because when you observe his body with tattoos, you see the number 18 tattooed on his shoulder, and that is a reference to white power skinheads, 18 being AH for Adolf Hitler. So this one guy, I'm just gonna keep rehashing it, I apologize, but he's hung out with Allen Ginsberg since he was 1 year old. He got in a band that was Krishna, ended up becoming the first skinhead in America, definitely has racist tattoos, and when you put all those ideas together, it's kind of like this theosophy magic spell. We find, going back a little further to his mother's name was Rose Fallou. She was a spiritual wife to a very famous occultist named Harry Everett Smith. So we find a direct link between Mom and Allen Ginsberg. She was at Ginsberg's bedside when he died, so she was, hanging out with Ginsberg while he's died. She was that close. She's spiritual wife to this famous occultist, Harry Everett Smith. And we got this guy who has this incredibly chaotic life. So right there, and Ginsberg has his hands in other places, but that is an unbelievable spectacle to observe and read about, and then see all of these different pieces that formulate. Because I have to make the question known, like, what kept Allen Ginsberg from touching Harley? I mean, did Harry Everett Smith stop it? The wizard? I mean, to me, it's kind of like Rosemary's Baby, and her name's Rose Fallou, so it's like Rosebud. And I visualize like Harley in his mom's womb, Harry Everett Smith and Ginsberg and all these guys doing some Rosemary Baby stuff. And here comes Harley. And then he, like I said, he brings Krishna hardcore in. He brings racism or skinheads into the lexicon. He just does all this other social engineering, whether in the know or out of the know. He's within the last few years, he went to a show of the Cro-Mags, and they wouldn't let him perform, so he stabbed some people, and then he was stabbed back. And this is a grown man. And another side fact is he actually teaches Anthony Bourdain's children mixed martial arts. So I just want to throw that in there, too. And Anthony Bourdain looks pretty spooky.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah, this stuff is so unbelievably crazy. So that's a Ginsberg connection that touches the beginning, and it touches the late 80s into the 90s, because, again, the Cro-Mags were seminal in sound change for a genre called New York hardcore. And just one more connection. Allen Ginsberg's cousin was Oscar Janiger, and I make this connection to just display the LSD psychedelic connection. Oscar Janiger, for most people who don't know, he dosed Aldous Huxley. I mean, if you look, Allen Ginsberg's cousin dosed Aldous Huxley for the first time. I think we can make some speculative comfort zone leaps in that realm that Allen Ginsberg probably did some doses in his time, besides the fact he says he did, besides the Yage papers. I mean, I think that's a pretty blatant connection right there, connecting counterculture, beat poets, hippies, LSD with the original punkers and later punkers, just to throw it out there like that.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't know any of that. By the way, I did want to say too, because I think we were discussing CIA cults on Boiler Room recently, which is a podcast that I go on, and I had not thought about Moonies in a while, and I don't mean to change the subject, but I was kind of doubting myself because I wasn't sure if there was a George Harrison Moonies connection, but actually there is a connection between the Bhaktivedanta Manor, which I guess George Harrison owned or ran at some period. This was where they tried to export Hinduism into the West, The Beatles played a big role in that, of course. But this had some connection apparently to the Moonies, and there's another manor. It's where transcendental meditation took root in the West, and I want to say the Beatles hung out there too with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. That's where the Beatles were tripping acid and doing TM with that guy. And I think the Moonies have some connection to that estate too. That whatever that estate is, I just can't think off the top of my head what the name of it is. Some manor in England. And it may even be that one that was the Rothschild Manor, some crazy shit like that, the one that you see in the movies, that's the Rothschild estate in Batman or whatever. I want to say at one time that was where the Beatles and TM was going down. Had you heard of any of that?
No, but I mean, nothing shocking, and I could actually take a lot of what you said and substantiate a lot of those different ideas that build that idea. But yeah, I've not heard that specifically, but nothing shocking. But yeah, I could take your hand and we could go to England and look at the island commune he set up for these hippies that developed free festivals, that pumped out LSD, that motivated the band Crass. I could run rampant with substantiate every idea except for I've not heard that idea. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense.
Yeah, after a while you forget where you source this stuff, but that's probably why you're charting it all. So yeah, let's move on to who you got next on your list. So this is great. You've done your homework.
Last one, last beat poet anyway, and last handoff from hippies, LSD to punk rock, and it's a big one. It's John Sinclair, the poet John Sinclair. He's known primarily for being one of the major players in the White Panther movement. And pulling up his page here.
What is the White Panther movement?
That's the it's the I don't know what the word is, but it's the tangential white version of the Black Panther movement.
Okay.
So yeah, there was the Yippies. In this time, it's the late '60s, and a lot of this is concentrated in '68. There's like the Weather Underground. There's the Yippies. There's the White Panthers, the Black Panthers, and all those kind of fringe groups that appear, after doing this analysis, to be controlled, limited hangouts, controlled social engineering groups. And, I got plenty of reasons to think that. Going back to John Sinclair and his link to punk, John had mentioned, I think you asked John the question, where was the origins of punk? And I tend to think a case that's most easy to argue is that it was actually started in Detroit. And it was started, in my opinion, and again, it's debatable, but I mean, the real, one of the sidetrack here. One of the comments also is they don't feel there's a push or an agenda, so that's why I'm saving this best for last and where we're going with that. But so they there's a band called MC5, and they formed in 1964, and I feel that they're the most influential, important punk band there is. I feel they're probably the very first for the American scene. I feel it started in America. I think it was America, in the Americas, it was Detroit, New York, London, LA. I think it's something of that order. But we got Sinclair and the Michigan connection. And so John Sinclair, again, is as well as being involved in a terrorist organization, quote unquote, he's the manager of a band called MC5. And MC5 were known, let me see here, I'm trying to find this quote just to knock this one out. Okay, so just to knock out the psychedelic connection one more time, this is a quote from John Sinclair about him and the MC5 during a promotion. We were totally committed to carrying out our program. We breathed revolution. We were LSD-driven total maniacs in the universe. All right, I dropped the mic. There's that. Okay. So the beat poet, John Sinclair, who also managed the Yippies, White Panther movement, also managed MC5, says that MC5 is a total LSD-driven, we're maniacs. I mean, so there we go right there. Some fun stories. They have a lot of roots. They're referred to by as inspiration by many bands after them up until today. And even bands like the White Stripes have married into like the Smith family, which is Fred Smith was in MC5. Fred Smith married Patti Smith, who I think is the queen of punk rock. And their offspring, I can't remember their name right now, married one of the White Stripes. So they're still relevant, even though they were some dirty acid head punkers, technically, and during the hippie days. So I'm going to talk about a few of the players and a couple ideas that happen. Two of the players, and these are all main guys through history, but one of them's Wayne Kramer, and another one is Michael Davis. And I bring up those two guys first because they both ended up in a Lexington Federal Corrections Center, and they actually ended up there at the same time, unbeknownst to each other. And this was in the 70s, I believe. And why that's important is because, again, this totally, this LSD-driven maniac posse ended up in a facility that actually was one of, if not the leading drug research center for MKUltra. And it was in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yes, John Marks mentions that place. It was like, I believe it was a prison/psychiatric institution.
Yeah, so a number of different titles. I think officially now it's called the Federal Medical Center in Lexington.
Yeah.
I think it was called the Narcotic Farm, and there was also the Addiction Research Center, and I think that title is where Harris Isbell, open MK Ultra CIA connection, was working out of that titled office, the Addiction Research Center. And all of that is at the Federal Medical Center in Lexington. So we have...
This, by the way, is the reason why some researchers, and I'm not positive on this just because I can't prove it per se, but it's this very connection that I think suggests, which I think Dave McGowan talks about in a couple books, actually, Laurel Canyon and Program to Kill, the possibility of rehab centers, directly being connected to MK Ultra. I mean, that's at least one example there.
Yeah, and there's more for sure. You can look at Lou Reed at the Rockland Center. You can look at Iggy Pop at UCLA, where incidentally Britney Spears went to when she shaved her.
Good point.
I got a few of those guys peppered through the database for sure, because that's an anomaly I pay attention to. And again, what I'm doing here with MC5 is speculating, because again, MK Ultra was roughly early to mid 50s forward to the 60s or something, and all the paperwork was destroyed in the 70s. And these guys were in there in the 70s, so it's way after Harris Isbell, or was it? I don't know. But still, I find it amazing that they both were there unbeknownst to each other. And it was due to drug issues. They, let me see here. I got to find this real quick. Somebody else was there. I want to say William Burroughs was there too. Not at the same time, but just to kind of substantiate that last idea.
While you're looking at that.
Yeah, William Burroughs was there as well. He was committed to the Narcotic Farm.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I did double check, and it was the Rothschild Mansion. It's not owned by the Rothschilds anymore, but it's called Mintmore Towers. And it's an English country house in Buckinghamshire, and it's actually the house that's used in Eyes Wide Shut. It's also the house that's used as Bruce Wayne's manor in Batman Begins, and what a strange coincidence, it's the former headquarters for Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's Transcendental Meditation Foundation. Where the Beatles were tripping out. So the Beatles were tripping out at the place where Stanley Kubrick was filming the Eyes Wide Shut orgies. You can't make this shit up.
So let me just jump off course pretty far, but so Crass was started by a conspiracy theory, basically, and this guy got killed, and he actually was in the hospital that Stanley Kubrick used to film Clockwork Orange.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think that one might be a fake death, and that's, like I said, my fuse will blow if I start trying to spin all that together.
Well, and of course, Clockwork Orange is obviously about MK Ultra. There's absolutely no question there.
Yeah, exactly. And the guy who I'm talking about, I think I connected to like the Russell family, the Russell dynasty family too. So I think he like faked his death to get out of the hippie promoting scene, and I got some pretty speculative ideas, but either way, I got a lot of facts that'll give a lot of questions to people's minds. Back to this with MC5. They're basically a provocateur band, and they were called, and again, they're being handled by John Sinclair. And
so
they were
let me ask you like when you say a provocateur band, do you think that like the handler or the managers, people in the background, are they really literally wanting to use the band to like get teens maybe like riled up to go tear down a park or something, or bust out some windows and throw a few cocktails? I mean, is that part of it? Are they literally wanting that kind of stuff?
In this situation, I believe the answer is a definitive yes.
Okay.
I mean, absolutely. Just to go to addressing that, let me see here. They lived on a compound. They lived on a compound. I gotta find this. Hold on, because I'm kind of sidetracking here. Okay. So both bands. Here's just a quote. Both bands, the MC5 and a sister band called the Up. Both bands members lived in the White Panther founder John Sinclair's compound or commune. So they all lived in a collective commune ran by John Sinclair, acid dealing. I'll tell you why I think is a CIA operative too in a minute. Yeah, I mean, they lived in a commune. That's their terms. So I think, yeah, that's for these guys
so
directly.
That's like, all the elements of social engineering, mind control, provocateuring. It's just all right there.
Oh, yeah. And we also have evidence that they took part in some action. So the 1968 Democratic National Convention, they're credited for starting the riot.
Are you serious? Really?
On stage, yeah.
Yeah, I've read. I cannot think where I read this. It may have been in Dave's book. I can't remember, but somebody argued that it was the CIA and the professors who actually got that all stirred up. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense because that's in the Cold War. The CIA wouldn't be doing that. No. Remember, the CIA was behind Gloria Steinem, Miss Magazine, and feminism, and that's because the CIA is just basically a front for the Rockefeller Corporation. Or excuse me, Rockefellers and the Rockefeller Foundation and Wall Street. And if you read the Rockefeller's authorized biography, there's a whole chapter on Abby Rockefeller putting millions of dollars into the feminist movement back in the 60s via the CIA.
Yeah. Abby Rockefeller went to the Cosmopolitan Club, and Ian MacKay's grandma used to hang out at the Cosmopolitan Club, just to throw that little nugget out there. And Ian MacKay is one of the puppet masters to third wave feminism, right, girl? So yeah, like it's
there
all.
You go. Exactly.
To me,
right.
I see all these connections now. Doing this weird research, it's like wow, it all becomes clear. But well, so
the vanguard of the left is very useful. I know you know this, but for people listening who might be skeptical or wondering why, I've talked about this for several years, especially if you go back to my Tragedy and Hope series. The reason that the vanguard of the left or the radical quote-unquote anti-establishment movements, the reason they're useful to big capital or big bankers is because they're a means by which you can push the culture in a certain direction if you so desire. So if you're the Rockefeller family and you openly say you want to get rid of the family, one of the ways that you could do that is through pop culture and pushing things like feminism, abortion, transgender, homosexuality, all of these things are even in, there's a 1969 Planned Parenthood memo by Bernard Burroughs that literally says that. It literally says we've got to promote homosexuality, destroy the family, abortion, so that we can have population control. So once you understand that from their perspective, it's all about social control, it makes perfect sense why you're going to bring these idiotic 18, 19-year-olds who are just lower to middle class kids, white kids who don't know any better, feed off of them, right, be sort of vampires, and move them in a certain direction, give them the record deals, whatever, for the larger purpose of pushing the culture in a certain, toxifying the culture and pushing it in a certain direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's Kabbalah. It's Jose Barrera's version of Kabbalah, in my opinion.
Yes, the way it relates directly to Kabbalism would be through, and there's different schools of Kabbalism, but for the most part, it's pretty much Gnostic and sort of dialectical. Yeah. And the idea here being that good is just boiling it simply down to, bypassing all this talk about pathways and worlds and Sephiroth. It's about the idea that the good is just an analog to the bad, and that both evil and good are sort of corollaries and necessities. You'll find this in, for example, Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, which is very influenced by different Kabbalists. And in that regard, that's why what you said, well, why would that be useful to the establishment? Well, Zbigniew Brzezinski can talk about, for example, the need to control black markets because that's a big part of the economy. So from their perspective, from the pragmatic state perspective, you want to be able to have full spectrum dominance, and part of that full spectrum from the state's approach is bad guys, right? It's black markets. It's this evil stuff. So that's what Kabbalism would make sense to that kind of a scheme or that kind of a system, because evil's just another manifestation of what happens in nature, supposedly.
Yeah. Absolutely. So where was I at? Chicago. Okay. So they're directly attributed, and here's the quote: MC5's appearance at the festival helped spark the 1968 Chicago riots. And so just to establish, I'm going to go in two directions on this band real quick. Just to establish some super high strangeness with John Sinclair, the handler who had the commune that these bands lived on, and again, one of the top level White Panther Party members.
You start to see a pattern here, right? Communes and handlers in the background. Sounds kind of like Manson and process type stuff. It happens
in England too. It happens over in England. I got these dudes, like Lennon donates an island to these guys to do this. I mean, I got that all charted down too. So John Sinclair is attached to a bombing, and I think it's in Lansing, Michigan. It's titled "The Bombing of a CIA, the A2 CIA office," and he did it, and I guess it's credited to the White Panther Party, and I guess another gentleman who stood trial for it. His name was Poon Plumandan. And so Poon Plumandan was the minister, quote unquote, minister of defense for the White Panthers, where MC5 was like the minister of entertainment, and they had all these weird positions. But Poon Plumandan, he actually became one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives for a while. And again, this is the guy who co-conspirated to blow up this CIA building, and I believe it's in Michigan. But they got let go. John Sinclair did more time getting arrested for weed than he did getting arrested for this bombing of a CIA building.
Well, that just reeks of absurdity and obviousness there, doesn't it? I mean, that's like totally transparent. It reminds me of almost a mirrored situation with Richard Aoki and the Black Panthers. He was the FBI guy, admitted publicly to have armed the Black Panthers to give them the public appearance of being exceptionally radical, which pretty much ruined and destroyed them. And he later got in trouble for being a part of this radical group. But then I can't remember if he served time or not. There's you can find plenty of mainstream articles about Richard Aoki. But yeah, it came out in the court trials that he was just the FBI informant.
And so Poon Plumandan gets let out, or like does his time, or whatever the case may be, because it's a tough story to follow, especially since I believe it's probably it's absolutely staged, at least in my opinion, and it might be even fake. But Poon Plumandan goes from being on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives to driving equipment for Foreigner and Kiss. So that's where he went after being the Minister of Defense for the White Panthers. He was driving equipment around for rock and roll bands.
It also makes me think of the Newburgh Sting, which we've talked about with Chris. There's a similar situation where you have radical action that leads to certain people not getting in trouble. And also, like the guy who provocateured the whole thing, it also reminds me of the Patty Hearst situation, which I don't believe she suffered anything for that large-scale psyop, and even Mae Brussel, who I don't think is that reliable. Back in the 70s, she was saying that was staged. I couldn't believe it. Like, I came across this old audio of her talking about the Patty Hearst thing being staged and the police being in on it to some degree, and that's probably going on to some degree with the Weatherman type situation too. So my point just being, I don't mean to get off subject, but this is a pattern that you see across the board when you look into these things, when you look into FBI operations, sting operations, quote unquote terror operations, and people sometimes mysteriously seem to get in no trouble, or they're promoted. They get some awesome job out of this once they've done their duty to the state. And in getting a criminal record, for those that don't know, that's a good way for the system to bring you into the system and tell you you're going to be our confidential informant.
Yeah, that and blackmail for sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I'm going to move a little sideways, just
Sure.
continue, just kind of spin off from the 1968 Chicago riots. There was two, basically. There's the Democratic National Convention and just basic Chicago riots. But we find that a number of events actually transpire across the world in 68. And then doing my research, I named like the White Panthers, the Yippies, and so on. But there I found a bunch of radical groups that actually funnel under a philosophy called Situationist International.
Right.
And these are anarchist groups that come from underneath it, and they actually participate in a lot of quote-unquote actions around 68. So there's things going on in 1968 France that is directly related to Situationists. There's stuff going on in London, Ireland. There's stuff going on across the world. And there's these little radical groups that you can look up, and then they say who they're who they followed or whatever, like who influenced them, I should say.
Right.
And almost all of these at least have Situationist International as one of the mentionings, but they kind of also mention each other. And I think these groups are incredibly important because one group, for example, and I've not mentioned this, links directly to the Frankfurt School.
You've been listening to my interview with Nino, one of the co-researchers over at Four Horses Asses of the Apocalypse, together with John Adams and their buddies. And we've been talking about all of the crazy connections between punk music and the establishment, the so-called counterculture, and the LSD MK Ultra serial killer phenomenon. If you would like to hear the full series, then you can check out fourhorsesasses.blogspot.com, and all of their work is collected there. If you'd like to hear the rest of this interview, which has some unique and new information, then you can subscribe to Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year at the PayPal links at my site. You can also purchase my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, to do where we do the same thing basically, but with film. This is my book that has now reached #1 in the new release category on Amazon for film in Hollywood. So very proud of that. And you can get signed copies directly from me at the Esoteric Hollywood tab at jaysanalysis.com. And you can do those inside and outside the U.S. Thank you for listening.